Hi, I'm Jess Brand. I'm the executive director of the Wren Collective and the Wren Action Group, and I'm here with my good friend and the Dallas County District Attorney and former judge, John Creuzot. Hi, DA Creuzot. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So I wanted to bring you here amidst the chaos of all the news cycles. Some people might have missed something really incredible that happened out of your office last week. In 70 years ago, Tommy Lee Walker was executed for the 1953 rape of Venice Parker. Tommy Lee Walker was a black man. Miss Parker was a white woman. It was a very high-profile case. And your office formally exonerated him last week, as did the county commission. And as the Innocence Project said in that hearing, it was the first time they had participated in a posthumous exoneration, meaning an exoneration after the state had put someone to death. And to my knowledge, it's the first formal exoneration that the state executed someone who was innocent, certainly the first in Texas, maybe the first in the nation. And so we're going to talk about the things that went wrong in that case that led to the wrongful conviction and the wrongful death sentence. But first, can you just tell us about the case, what happened, the flashpoints in it?
Yeah, so the broad outlines of the case was Tommy Lee Walker was a 19-year-old African American man who lived his life peacefully and happily in Dallas, Texas. Venice Parker was slightly over 30, white female who also lived her life peacefully and happily in Dallas, Texas. And one night in 1953, I think it was October or so of 53, um, uh, two people who worked at Love Field, which is our in-town airport, were leaving work and saw a person crawling up from a ravine and into the street near the airport. And they stopped, and she had been slashed in the neck and looked pretty roughed up. Anyway, she was bleeding profusely. She had been cut in a jugular vein. And they put her in her car, took her back to Love Field, where they knew a police officer would be. But there were other people, civilians, who were there and saw her and her condition in the car. Somewhat amazingly, despite the fact that everybody said she was either dead or near death, the police officer testified that she sat up and actually told them that a Negro did this to me or cut me or whatever her words were. But Negro was the most important part of it. Now, at that time in Dallas, there was a big scare going around in the white community that there was a big black Negro walking around naked. He was a prowler and he was raping white women. And this had become the talk of the town. People were on edge. In fact, so much on edge that there was one example of a white man going to visit his white friend, and the friend shot him because he thought he was his prowler. But nonetheless, the police started rounding up black men, young black men especially, and questioning them. No probable cause, just taking them in and questioning them. And obviously, there was an atmosphere of fear amongst black men in the community. So one, and I'm not certain who he is, probably in an effort to get him off his back, told him, well, you ought to go talk to Tommy Lee Walker. He used to work in that area, which he did, but at the time of the offense did not, and said he likes white women. Now, whether that's true or not, nobody knows, but it certainly moved them in Tommy Lee Walker's direction. So without probable cause, they arrested him, took him in, sweated him out, left him in a room for hours, and eventually took a statement that they wrote and he signed, not really confessing to the offense of murder or capital murder, but confessing to being there, having a knife in his hand, and that the woman herself jumped into the knife and caused the wound to her neck. Now, if you've been in criminal justice any amount of time, you know that's how they work somebody into saying something to put them at the location, put a weapon in their hand, and somehow causing the injury that caused the death. And then they go forward with a capital murder case on him. And so the problem with that confession was he said, number one, it was the wrong month. Number two, he said he rode a bus home from that spot and there was no bus to ride home from that spot. Even if he did ride a bus home, if you cut someone in the jugular vein, it spurts blood every time the heart beats. And so he would have obviously been noticed and seen on a bus full of blood. The other problem with it wasn't a problem for them at the time, but it is today, is that the person who took the statement was a notorious captain who had a 100 DPD, Dallas Police Department captain, who claimed he had a 100% or close to a clearance rate. Only problem with that was he was perhaps at the time a Klansman, but certainly a former Klansman, because we have the records of that. So Tommy Lee Walker was charged, and the then District Attorney Henry Wade and others looked at this statement and realized that it could not be true. And so Henry Wade decided to personally investigate the case, and in fact went in with a polygrapher and at least one other person who was the second chair on the case, and took a second statement from Tommy Lee Walker. Now, mind you, no lawyers were granted to Tommy Lee Walker. He's a 19-year-old, no criminal record, in here facing off against these criminal justice professionals.
Yeah, and can you talk really briefly about how, like, that is wild, right? How unusual it is that the district attorney would take over what appears to be a totally investigation and does the investigation himself.
Well, it's one of the problems, and so Henry Wade gets a second statement from Tommy Lee Walker. Now, okay, at this point, protocol should be understanding that you're a potential witness in the case when you take a statement from a defendant who doesn't have a lawyer, and or whether he had a lawyer or not, you're a potential witness in the case. There should have been a recusal motion filed that the DA's office should have recused itself. In fact, that became problematic because when Tommy Lee Walker testified as to what was said to him, what was done to him, what he was led to believe, how he was lied to, he was told there were eyewitnesses that put in there at the scene, etc. All of this stuff. Henry Wade then takes the stand. He gets out of his first chair seat in the courtroom and goes and gets up on the witness stand. And the problem with that, obviously, is he should not have done that. That's a violation of all ethical rules. He should have at that time recused himself from the case. But he danced around and talked around the fact that there was a polygrapher in the room, knowing that that is inadmissible. He still, in so many ways, brought it up and left the impression that Tommy Lee Walker took a polygraph and failed it. Now, first of all, we don't know that he took a polygraph. And as you know, anybody involved in criminal justice, you can cause a failure of a polygraph. They could actually pass all of the relevant questions, and then you ask some other question that they don't pass, and it's labeled a failure. But nonetheless, we really don't know what questions were asked, what answers were given, and whatever happened on that. So Tommy Lee Walker, within a matter of months, was tried and convicted and sentenced to death. So that's the broad outlines. There are more details, and I'll let you ask me questions about those.
Yeah, I want to sort of break down. Well, first I want to talk about how your office gets involved in the case, right? Because normally a case goes through the system, there's a trial, someone's convicted, sentenced to death, there's state appeals, there's federal appeals, and you might get involved in something that wasn't involved, that you didn't try, that your office didn't prosecute because it happened 10 years ago, but usually someone's still alive. This is really unusual because the state had executed this 19-year-old man. So can you talk to us about how you got involved in it?
So there's an award-winning journalist. She had worked CBS and national news and what have you, worked with Dan Rather. But she lives in Dallas. She and her husband are both journalists. And she became interested early on in the early 2000s as we were finding DNA cases. And she was curious as to whether or not there was anybody from Dallas who had been executed, and perhaps DNA could solve that riddle of whether they did it or not. Now, obviously, in this case, being so long ago, we could not. I'll just get to that right now. DNA didn't become a factor in this case. But she started looking into this and asking questions of prominent black citizens of Dallas and asking, is there anybody that you think who's been wrongfully executed? And the same name came up, Tommy Lee Walker. And so she began that investigation, and from her standpoint as a journalist. And she actually worked very hard on it and got to a point where she felt that she couldn't go anymore because people were dead, evidence was missing, etc. But she went to every library. She did gather a lot, the transcript and newspaper articles, and got a sense of the time. But then told our first African American judge, who's unfortunately deceased now, she said, Judge, I'm working on this, and I don't know if I can finish this. And there's so much missing. And in his inimitable fashion, I can see it today. He pulled his glasses down, as she describes, and said, if you care about justice, you'll keep working on it. And that struck a chord in her, and she kept working. And she eventually wrote an article in D Magazine, D as in Dallas Magazine. And you can find that if you Google D Magazine and Tommy Lee Walker. They've done a couple of updates since we've had this hearing. But that article is there. And so that's what started it. And the Innocence Project got on it. And Professor Burnham from Northeastern University got on it. And they brought it to us. And as many exonerations are brought to us by defense counsel, writ counsel, post-conviction counsel. And what we do, as a matter of course, is because we cannot look through all of the cases and the issues that bring us, we just don't have the staff. We turn the files over to them and have them look. And whatever they give us, we'll follow up on it. That's how many of our exonerations occur in Dallas County. And so this was one of those cases. And the more we looked into it, the more concerned we became. Of course, now this time, Judge Bedford is dead. Many of the other people are dead. And so we're working kind of on our own with them to piece this puzzle together. And so they brought it to us a couple of times. Most recently, 2 or 3 months ago, we met. I met with them both times that they came to the office. My staff stayed in constant contact with them. And we came to the conclusion after looking at everything and looking at science and false confessions and looking at the details of this confession, how there were so many gaps in it that were intentional gaps because they couldn't be explained and they couldn't make sense for this man to be guilty. And yet these gaps were there. And what we came to the conclusion was that these were 2 false confessions. There was no physical evidence to tie this man to this scene. They brought on some additional evidence. They had 2 people who claimed that they were just driving down this very busy street at night and saw Tommy Lee Walker in the vicinity of where this happened. And of course, Tommy Lee Walker's picture had been splashed across every newspaper, news station as they existed at that time. And obviously, I know from my own experience, and one of the things I told our commissioner's court as we went through this is I've had former police officers tell me, and I've seen it, where I can get somebody to confess if I want to, and I can get somebody to pick out a photo if I want to. And we've had one exoneration in Dallas, for example, where the woman said, I picked him out of the live lineup because they told me he was the one. And I believed them, even though he did not. I don't think he's the one, but they told me, and I went to court and I testified on the belief that that they were right and I was wrong.
I was
And so you
certain.
find all of these things in this case. So it became pretty obvious that Tommy Lee Walker was falsely accused and wrongfully convicted. And, you can call it an execution, but really under the circumstances, it's more of a murder of Tommy Lee Walker.
So I want to focus on 2 things that went wrong in this case. There's a lot. I mean, the 3 themes that stood out to me are a pretty corrupt police department and district attorney. You've kind of touched on that, so I'm going to leave that for purposes of time. Then false confessions and just rank racism. And I want to start with that. And I'm hoping you can walk us through how this narrative of a scary black man led to a 19-year-old who was wrongfully executed in Dallas County.
Well, so let's talk about the description of this so-called uh, big Negro. By the way, the story was he was walking around naked. Now, can you imagine that in 1953 Dallas? And he was a prowler. He was raping white women. That's just kind of stupid in and of itself. But Tommy Lee Walker, I think on his best day, standing in a pair of boots, was like 5'3" and probably weighed 120 pounds. But once they had these two confessions, so-called confessions in their hand, all of this merged together. Tommy Lee was that person. And there was a lot of pressure on the police to solve this. And so he became the solution, quite frankly. And racism just propelled this thing along. And the lack of due process. In fact, so let's go back to how did Tommy Lee Walker get a lawyer? There was an African American lawyer either in the jail or at the courthouse, I can't remember, and saw all of this commotion as they brought this man through for whatever they were doing, and became curious and asked and realized that he was the person who had been arrested, and he became more familiar. And he then contacted the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and there was a prominent lawyer who had worked with Thurgood Marshall in the area, and they took on his case, and they started kind of a GoFundMe page, long before we had GoFundMe, right? And then the black newspaper at the time, those were our newspapers. We weren't talked about or reported on in newspapers, the major newspapers in Dallas. And so it became obvious to the black community in Dallas that this kid, 19-year-old, was innocent. And one of the stronger points of his innocence is that his girlfriend was pregnant and about to deliver. The date of the offense, he was with his family and her. And the very next morning, she gave birth, to their child, who, if we go forward on this, showed up at this hearing. And also Venice Parker had a child, and he showed up at this hearing just last week. So you have the confluence of all these events and things, and you have a tremendous outpouring of support for Tommy Lee Walker. It was estimated that there were probably 1,000 black citizens of Dallas ringing the courthouse every single day of his trial in his support. And so that's how things came together. You asked one other question. What was that?
Well, we're going to talk on false confessions in a minute, but I mean,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can sort of, unravel that a little more for me, because he had a lot of support from the black community and a lawyer, and yet a jury convicted this black young man of a rape he didn't commit of a white woman, and so that wasn't enough. And I'm hoping you can explain to us, for people who don't know Texas, who don't know Dallas, who don't know what the jury was like, why that was.
Well, so Henry Wade was the district attorney well over 30 years. And he was rather young in his career at the time, early years, probably the first 4 or 5. Obviously, race relations were different. The perception of a black on black crime was that it was a misdemeanor. But killing a white woman, okay, you get at the top of the heap, and that needs to be solved. And they had a suspect, and they were going to see to it that this suspect was convicted, no doubt about it. I mean, the fact that you as the district attorney would go in and take a statement from someone. Tommy Lee Walker was lied to. He was told that there were witnesses when there were none. He was told that he failed the polygraph, which is really irrelevant anyway, but we don't really know that he actually failed the polygraph, but he was certainly told that and led to believe that. And so all of these events weighed on him. And if you can, I came along in the latter stages of segregation, and I know my perception, and I tell my police chiefs today that had one of them walked up to me back then when I was a child in the early 60s and on in their uniform, I probably, and I mean this truthfully, I probably would have urinated on myself out of fear. And so there's Tommy Lee Walker alone for hours and hours and days in police custody and probably being told, being tricked along to sign this statement. We have witnesses, we know you did it, but you know, maybe she caused her own death. And that's not capital murder. That's not murder. And I've seen this myself. I have ruled on confessions where this tactic was used and suppressed them as a judge. And so it doesn't take much to understand that when you want and you desire, when you are focused to get a confession out of someone, that you can lend mitigation to their statement when in fact you intend to use it to fully prosecute them for the death of someone. So all of these things put together, knowing what we know now and understanding what their goal was at the time, led me to the conclusion that these were false confessions. And let me say another thing. I talked about the first confession where he gets on a bus and goes home, and there was no bus. Okay, there's no bus passing there. But the second confession taken by Mr. Wade, he solved that. Okay, and he had Tommy Lee Walker just walking off, across Love Field where planes are, and never does anything more with it. Well, if you're a true investigator and you're trying to get to the bottom of things, you're going to walk somebody all the way back home, especially someone covered in blood. But he just left it alone. And so that too was a strong indicator that that was a false confession. And all he needed to do was get him off that bus. He just needed to get him going home. And by the way, I haven't said this, and I apologize, but home is 5 or 6 miles away. Okay, and so Tommy Lee Walker needed $5 to call an ambulance to get his girlfriend to the hospital to deliver his son. And so part of this was that he went in her purse after he killed her and took the $5. And so they merge all this stuff, sexual assault, robbery, and murder all together to create a capital murder case. And that's the framework of this and what they did to this young man.
So you really touched on the false confession issue. So I think I really just have two questions for you. They all frame
Okay.
around the same premise, which is that people really want to believe wrongful convictions and wrongful executions are things of the past, right? We're going to eventually go through all the DNA testing, and they're not going to happen again. My first question is, you went really far back to undo this, but the trauma of a wrongful conviction, it lives for a really long time in the family, and it affects everybody. And you talked about how Tommy Lee Walker's girlfriend had a baby right around when this happened. That's a child who never grows up with their father. I was so struck by how much this meant to the family when I watched the hearing on Commissioner's Court, and we'll link to it. Can you talk about why this was so important to his family and loved ones, and how they reacted as you went through this process?
Well, his son was present. Now his son is well into his 70s and you know suffering very mild cognitive decline. As you could tell, he repeated things over and over. But he grew up without a dad, and he grew up being told that his dad was executed for killing someone, and he has carried that with him. He even went so far as to say, he caused me to be an excellent father. His 3 sons were there. And the pain of this um, killed his mother. She knew where Tommy Lee Walker was. She knew that Tommy Lee Walker was with her and did not commit this crime. And yet, within a period of from 53 when the crime occurred to 54 when the trial was had, this man was taken. This 120-pound man was taken and executed and killed by the state of Texas. And she never got over that. And she became an alcoholic. And he testified before Commissioner's Court that anytime that this was brought up, she just went straight and started drinking. And she died at a young age. And so the impact, but also, I was talking last week, a week before last to this, I think last week, to some ministers here about the hearing that we were going to have and the significance of it, and that this has never been done to our knowledge in the United States. And off to my side was a much older man who was a minister or retired minister. And he said, I knew Tommy Lee Walker, which surprised me because, you don't expect anybody to be alive. And he said, I'm 80, I think he said 89 years old. And I used to live over there. And I know where Tommy Lee Walker was. He was with us that night. And I'll never, ever forget this. And what they did to him was wrong. And so there's at least one person who still suffers the pain. There's the family who suffers the pain of what happened to Tommy Lee Walker. And even though the vast majority of the community who suffered the pain are dead and gone, it's still a wrong that needs to be righted. And so, in my opinion, even though we weren't able, under the circumstances, to do a state exoneration, Dallas County, which was the place where he lived and the place where Venice Parker lived, and she was done wrong because her killer actually got away and was never held accountable. So bringing all of this together, these two boys at the time, now in their 70s, they were both there in the courtroom, and to bring them together and to lay this out showed that we have done wrong by Tommy Lee Walker, grievously wrong. We took his life, and that needed to be laid out, and it needed to be made known for future generations, and it needed to be made known to the police that they can get confirmation bias and just focus. I'm sure there was some amount of that in this, plus the overt racism. So I think it was just important to get this done and be a clarifying moment for the history of Dallas County that we can recognize when we've done a grievous wrong. It won't bring the person back, but it's a recognition and it's an apology and it's a way to go forward to heal whatever harms are still around about that.
And my last question is, what people say wrongful convictions is a thing of the past. Racism isn't as bad. Query whether that's true. We have better police investigation techniques. We have forensic science. We have all of those things. Do people still get it wrong? And what protections do offices like yours need to take to try to prevent as much as they can against wrongful convictions?
Well, I'll take the last one because it's the easiest one. What do offices like mine do? We have a law in Texas called the Michael Morton Act. And Michael Morton was a man who was convicted and sentenced and spent 25 years in prison for killing his wife, and he did not kill her. And evidence was withheld. To make a long story short, so 20 or so years ago, maybe a few more, 25. Well, I'm sorry, it's 2014. The Michael Morton Act was passed by the legislature, which requires us to turn over almost everything except non-privileged or non-confidential information. And even if we think it's privileged or confidential, we have to state why we're withholding it. And it gives the defense an opportunity to litigate that issue in front of a judge. So confessions or statements of suspects are now recorded. Interviews of witnesses are now recorded. So we have a much better opportunity to see to it that a case is correct and right. Of course, we have body cams now, we have dash cams, security cams. And so in a lot of ways, the criminal justice system is way better, functions way better than it did, obviously, before 2014 and certainly before 1953, 54, 55, 56. Now let's go back to racism in the criminal justice system. It is my belief that post-Reconstruction policing and state laws across the United States, not just in the South. We know what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis, but across the nation, regardless of what you felt about the secession of the states, criminal justice was centered in large part around the suppression of Black folks, men and women. And there were many laws passed that encouraged the arrest and incarceration of Black citizens in this state and other states and all around the United States. And so I think I've done a good job, and I have some numbers that support it, of communicating to our police chiefs that they are not racist, but they have inherited a racist system, and they've been trained. And I've encouraged them to think about their 30 or so more year careers. Who trained them on the streets? Somebody who had 30 years of experience at the time. So we're talking about the thought process of 50 to 60 years ago being implanted in their brains, and how they go about doing their jobs, how they supervise their troops. And I think that's had a profound impact. I'm seeing a lot of difference in, for example, misdemeanor marijuana cases. I took the year 2018 before I got in office, and last year, 2025. We have a 74% decrease in the filing of misdemeanor marijuana cases by the police agencies. And that's significant because, people take this the wrong way when at first when I say that marijuana, yes, it's a gateway drug. It's a gateway to probable cause and a gateway to a criminal record. And those things stick with people, young people, for the rest of their lives, even if they get probation. And so the fact that the police are not filing those cases, and in Dallas County, 90% of the arrests for those cases are black and brown, year in and year out. So when we can reduce that by 74%, and that's on the discretion of the police because they're not filing the cases with us, that means that we are making progress. There are other areas where we're making progress, but relevant to this discussion, I'll leave it at that. So I think that we are making progress. It's tangible, it's measurable, but we still have a long way to go.
Thank you, DA Creuzot, for joining us. Thank you for what you did.
Welcome.
Yours is certainly not the only case that came before you where someone was wrongfully executed in this country, but you're the only one I'm aware of who's really, really done something about it, and it meant a lot to the community and to the family. And so thanks for joining us to talk about it, and I hope you stay safe in an icy and snowy Dallas County.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.